Welcome to another Ocean Ideas Talk, brought to you by ocean lovers.
Please join me in welcoming back to the stage the ABC's Natasha Mitchell to discuss whether the high seas are really the Wild West. Join me in welcoming Natasha, who will introduce our amazing panel.
Oh, here we are. We're turning into little piles of water in here. Hey, who was at the last two sessions? Excellent. Thanks for sticking around. How wonderful to see you. Welcome to the Ocean Lovers Festival if you've just joined us, and this is their wonderful talks program. Thanks to Robin for emceeing the entire event. Let's give it up for Robin. Yeah. So we're here to talk about high and deep seas, and I want to acknowledge that we're on Gadigal country, 60,000 years more of relationships to these seas around us by the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And we are recording today's event for Big Ideas. I'm Natasha Mitchell, and I host a show on the ABC on radio and on the ABC Listen app. It's a podcast called Big Ideas. It rolls out 4 shows a week, and you can catch us there. So we're recording. Hey, 60,000 years is a really big number. And so is the fact that 70% of the planet's surface is ocean. And the average depth of the ocean is nearly 4 kilometres down. That's extraordinary, 4,000 metres down into the deep. And yet we've mapped more of the surface of Mars than we have of the ocean seabed, which is interesting. And so that means we understand so very little about what is down there. What species, what plants, what animals call the deep seas home, and the wild seas home, the high seas home. That hasn't stopped seabed mining, deep seabed mining, becoming a very serious proposition right now. So the excavation of the seabed for rare earth minerals that, in fact, we really desperately need right now for green technologies like batteries and solar cells and wind farms and the like, so that we can address climate change. So there's a really interesting, complex tension here about whether we exploit the deep sea bed or not. And also, as well as rare earth minerals, we also have an insatiable appetite for fish, and overfishing is pushing fishers into illegal fishing, which might end up on our shop shelves in our fishmongers here in Australia, no doubt. So we're going to be talking about that too. We have an incredible panel. What a jam-packed speed dating session we're going to have. Aline Jaekel is Associate Professor of International Law at the Australian National Centre for Ocean Resources and Security, big title at the University of Wollongong. And her research focuses on what's called the law of the sea and international law as it relates to our oceans, especially on the regulation and the governance and equity issues around deep seabed mining, and she acts as a government advisor for ongoing negotiations at what's called the International Seabed Authority. Thanks for joining us, Alina. Great to have you here. We've got Captain Peter Hammarstedt, who's Director of Campaigns for Sea Shepherd and is Chairman of Sea Shepherd Australia. They've got a table out there as part of the market here at Ocean Lovers Festival. Check them out. He captained the ocean-going vessel Bob Barker, having spent 20 years at sea, including 10 years in Antarctica. His work involves chasing and investigating illegal fishing vessels, amongst other things, and partnering with law enforcement agents to do so. It's really dangerous, hairy, very interesting work. Thanks for being here. I'm surprised you've got sort of land legs after all those years, I have to say. Matthieu Rytz is a producer, curator, photographer and award-winning film director focused on telling all sorts of complex human and environmental stories. And his latest film, it came out in 2023, I think it's doing the festival circuit at the moment, Deep Rising, is about the fate of the planet's last untouched wilderness, and that indeed is the deep ocean, and particularly deep seabed mining is its focus. Thanks for being here. Let's welcome them. So, quick question to get us started. Why do the deep and high seas matter to each of you? Alina?
It matters, well, the deep ocean in particular matters because it's one of the last frontiers that is more or less untouched by humans. And because we have an awful lot of species in the deep ocean that are completely unknown to science and therefore unknown to us. So there's a lot to explore, a lot of genetic resources to discover, and a lot to learn from the deep ocean.
Peter?
The reason that the high seas matter to me is that the high seas are an area that's essentially outside of any one specific national jurisdiction. And yet a lot of species in the oceans are migratory. Sharks, tuna, they are transnational in their migratory paths. And so in these global commons, migratory species are especially at threat when there isn't one specific country responsible, where there might be overlapping laws, where laws might be insufficient.
And Matthieu Rytz.
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely follow those two comments about, the deep ocean and the high seas being out of sight, out of mind. When we look at the ocean, it's just this beautiful flat blue horizon, but we don't see what's happening down there. So for us human, it's extremely difficult to understand the level of destruction. And talking about the deep ocean, I mean, 95% of the biosphere is the twilight zone. In fact, most of the life on Earth communicate just through lights and is so far from everything we know. So I think what is very important also to understand is, talking about deep seabed mining also is, as we understand and discover all the things, we also see all those economic opportunities, and we cannot afford to starting extracting more of the ocean before actually we know what role it has for us in this planet.
What did you want to investigate in your film Deep Rising?
So I started the whole story in 2018, and really the first thing was like hearing just deep seabed mining really intrigued me a lot. I was like, what are they talking about? Deep sea mining. But then it really became a very long journey, actually, and opening this Pandora box. And I think one of the most complex, environmental issue right now, with so many different layers of complexity, because it touched the supply chain, it touched the green revolution, it touched so many of those big conversations right now about, can we afford as a species to keep extracting finite resources? All those questions actually can be linked to deep seabed mining. So there's a lot of story that can be told about it.
Yeah. Aline, Jaekel, how close is the world to widespread deep sea mining? How much interest is there in excavating the seabed right now?
So there is a fair bit of interest in exploring minerals on the deep ocean, but in terms of exploiting, so commercial scale mining, there's actually only a few companies that are really pushing for that to start sooner rather than later. Most of the actors involved in mineral exploration have been states. So states have been exploring for minerals both within their national jurisdiction, so their coastal waters over which they have sovereign rights, and on the international seabed, so the area of the seafloor that lies beyond the jurisdiction of any one state.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? Just describe what deep sea bed mining would look like.
So it depends a bit on which mineral deposit you're talking about, but let's just focus on polymetallic nodules for now, which are those sort of potato-shaped rocks on the abyssal plains. They would be mined via underwater mining machines on the bottom of the ocean. That can be anywhere from 2 to 6 kilometres deep. The metals would then be transported up to the surface to a support vessel via riser pipes that can be, again, 2 to 6 kilometres long, and would then be dewatered on the vessel. And you have the return plumes, so the tailings, being pumped back into the ocean. We don't know at what depth, and that will determine to a degree what the environmental impacts will be, because those tailing plumes can be quite problematic for the marine
So they could
environment.
be like big clouds in the sea.
Correct.
We're talking about silver, gold, copper, manganese, cobalt, zinc. Now, these are all vital elements in driving a green economy, in solving the green energy crisis that we're, the energy crisis. So this is about, building clean energy technologies like batteries, etc., isn't it?
It is for some people, but that narrative is actually quite young, so it's quite a recent narrative. We do need metals for all sorts of industries, including green technology, but also building industries and so on. So we've always had a need for those minerals. Now, in terms of that narrative that we may need seabed mining for green energy technologies, that's been debunked by a number of studies by now. So we can certainly reach 100% renewable energies without the need for seabed minerals. partly because of technological innovations whereby next generation batteries may not need any cobalt. We have work underway for sodium ion batteries and other sort of batteries that use different, more abundant materials. So we can reduce the demand for some of those minerals, but not for all of them, of course.
So you're saying that that narrative is spin by the mining industry trying to get access to the seabed. Is that what you're suggesting?
Well, it's certainly a clever marketing campaign, I think, to raise two environmental issues, climate change and marine environmental protection, to pit them against each other. And I think that's a false dichotomy.
So closest to home, Nauru, PNG have both, those governments have both been involved in sponsoring mining companies to explore, to survey the deep seabed. But something happened in Norway this year that is very interesting indeed and really might set a precedent for this whole industry. What happened?
Yeah, so Norway is quite interested in exploring for seabed minerals within their coastal waters. So this is, again, not the high seas, not the international seabed, but within their coastal waters where Norway has full jurisdiction over those metals. And they've been opening up large areas of their seafloor for mineral exploration, which in terms was... which in part was to do with the fact that Norway, of course, is an economy powered on oil and gas. As we're transitioning away from that, it makes sense for those countries to look for alternatives.
We'll come back to some of the impacts of deep sea bed mining in a moment, but Captain, I love saying Captain Peter Hammarstedt. But Peter, take us into the high seas, not the deep seas, but both, I guess, which is where you've spent a lot of your time. How significant right now is the issue of illegal fishing? And do the products of illegal fishing come back to our stores here in Australia, to our fishmongers?
So the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization believe that 90% of the world's fisheries are either fully exploited or overexploited. And driving a lot of that is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, so-called IUU fishing, which is responsible for about 20% of the global catch of fish. As there's less and less fish to catch near coastlines, fishing vessels are going out further and staying out longer to catch fewer fish. That has really put the high seas on the political agenda. But what's more than that is as certain lucrative fish species, like different types of tuna, have become fewer in number, a lot of fishing companies have started fishing down the food web. And what that means is fishing companies fishing for species that weren't profitable in the past. And that's what we've seen with the Chinese distant water fishing fleet. Instead of targeting tuna, they're now pivoting and targeting squid, and they're targeting squid in high seas areas, these areas that are outside the authority or the maritime jurisdiction of any one particular country.
So give us an example of that, because you spent some time tracking, tracing, investigating a whole fleet of Chinese boats, didn't you, in the Galapagos, so a highly vulnerable, massively significant environment, ecosystem.
So about 2 years ago, there was a big news story. It was all over the world about a fleet of foreign fishing vessels, part of the Chinese distant water fishing fleet, fishing right outside the Galapagos Marine Reserve. And when I say fishing vessels, I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of these vessels, more than 600 in number, all lit up to attract squid. They're so lit up you can see them from a satellite in space. And I remember sailing among these ships and seeing lights in every direction and seeing this ocean light up like a desert city in the middle of the night. Each one of these ships, many of them with a history of illegal fishing in the waters of certain countries, vessels that have been arrested before, fishing in the waters of Peru illegally, the waters of Argentina illegally, vessels with a history of labor abuse, and yet fishing completely unmolested in the high seas.
Now that's interesting, completely unmolested. So you are there in your capacity with the Sea Shepherd, and you are actually, in some cases, working with authorities, aren't you? You're kind of doing the work that they should be doing.
So we've partnered with countries all around the African continent, countries with the political will to fight illegal fishing, countries with a coast guard, a navy, a police service, but without the vessel asset that can take the police to the scene of the crime. So we station their law enforcers on board our ship, people with the authority to board, inspect, and arrest vessels. And working with 8 countries around the African continent, we've assisted those countries to arrest 95 ships for illegal fishing to date, including 8 trawlers in the Gambia in West Africa just 10 days ago. So that's been a tremendous success. But in that area, the country has jurisdiction. It's like if a vessel is fishing without a permit in Australian waters, the Australian authorities can arrest it. Now, what happens if these fishing vessels are just outside that national boundary? That's where the high seas come in.
Right.
Who's responsible then?
Yeah. So in the case of the Galapagos, you mentioned that a number of those vessels had already been fined for and being caught for illegal fishing. They are remarkably skilled at being elusive, aren't they, to authorities where there are authorities to pay attention to them? How?
Well, there's been an increase in transparency as to what fishing vessels are doing at sea, especially tracking them on what's known as AIS, or automatic identification systems. These are essentially tracking devices, mandatory transponders that fishing vessels have to have turned on. But those can be manipulated. And if we're just monitoring vessel traffic from behind a computer screen, what we're seeing on that screen is what the operator on that boat is inputting into their transponding device. So off of the Galapagos, I documented 10 fishing vessels that were using the same identity. It would be the equivalent of 10 cars using the same 10 license plates.
What damage do they stand to do in a region like the Galapagos?
Considerable damage, and if you consider that these are the fishing fleets that have decimated fish populations in other parts of the world, these are the fishing operators that have decimated tuna and shark populations, that should be a warning sign. And what's happened to those species can happen also to squid. If somebody's fishing illegally in the waters of Australia, it's Australian jurisdiction, right? But if it's in the high seas, the jurisdictional authority is actually the flag state of the vessel, meaning whatever the ship, and every ship has to be flagged to a particular country. It needs to be registered to a particular country in the same way that a car does. So the Sea Shepherd ship Aline K, which is in Sydney right now, is flagged to the Netherlands. So if we're in the high seas, it's Dutch authority that applies to the ship. With these 600 squid boats, they're flagged to the People's Republic of China. That means that Beijing has to decide to take action against those boats. And that can be very, very difficult.
Because some of those squid being sold here?
Absolutely. That squid goes back to China, either directly from these boats, but also a lot of these boats are transshipping the catch at sea. So what that means is that they're meeting up with big refrigerated cargo vessels, and they're transferring the squid onto them, and the squid boats, the cargo ships are going back to shore so that the fishing boats can stay out longer. That's led to forced labor issues. And I remember going up to one of these squid boats. We had a journalist on board from the Associated Press. This was 16 months after COVID had been declared a pandemic by the World Health Organization. 16 months. We spoke to some Indonesian crew on board one of these Chinese squid boats. When he found out that we were American, the fisher asked, had COVID made it to the United States yet?
No idea.
So a year and a half, this guy had been at sea without any access to information, without any access to the news. And the squid that these vessels catch, they get offloaded in China, they're processed there, and then they do make it here to Australia.
Yes, and I remember seeing some footage from your team where one of the people said, I want to go home. So, you know, indentured labour and enforced labour is a serious issue in this sort of industry. Matthieu, Rytz, you have also been on the high seas with your cameras, I imagine, to create your film Deep Rising. What environmental concerns and impacts did you want to expose in your film about deep seabed mining?
Well, the truth is, we know so little about the deep ocean. Every time there's a new dive, every time they collect some DNA sample, there's new species. But not only new species, sometimes it's a whole branch of life that appears, meaning that every single form of life, us included, have like you see the tree of life that goes back to a single DNA. And they discover species that have a DNA that have no connection whatsoever for all life we know. So the precautionary approach, as I call it, in science, is so important because as we don't know yet what's down there. I mean, we know something, but we so much to discover, but at the same time rushing to extract, things without any idea of the consequences. I know the nodules we're talking about to get the nickel out.
So these are the nodules.
It's potato-sized nodules.
They're like little potatoes, aren't they?
And they're basically sitting on the seafloor. And they started with a nucleus. They started with a organic matter to start with, but they take 100 million years to create, and it's a living organism in a way. And I think what is quite interesting is a link, and that's a big scene in the film. Actually, is a link between organic matter and energy, because fossil fuel that power all the civilization we know today, it was based on organic matter that's actually fossilized. But before that, whalers were killing the whales to get the oil, also to lead the street of London. It was like this, So we kind of keep on going after things we are seeing as an asset, like nickel or cobalt or manganese, and we think it's just like a rock or it's just a mineral. But we have to understand it's actually a form of life.
Yes, and has developed over many millions of years to be there. Yeah. But there are life forms in the deep seas that are potentially under threat if deep sea mining does happen, aren't there?
Absolutely. I mean, there's removing the nodules is like removing in a rainforest would be equivalent to removing an old-grown tree. So you remove all this ecosystem, basically, where species put the eggs. But fundamentally, also, what is super important to understand about the deep ocean is also at the microbial level, and this is, what we're just starting to understand is how the cycle of life works, and how carbon is sinking, and how this very fragile planet, actually everything is interconnected. The biggest migration of life actually happen every night. All the species just go up the water column and go down and sink carbon.
Up the water column and down. Yeah.
And it's again, 95% of the biosphere is made of the deep sea below twilight. It's so it's a very fascinating. The deep ocean is absolutely fascinating, but it's also pretty much an alien space. So we need more. At least we need more science, or we need to understand better before doing any form of destruction. That's for sure.
So, Aline and Jaekel, this is your area of concern. Is how do we allow that science to get done? Who has access to the deep sea and to the deep sea bed? Who owns that space? Who regulates that space? Who has rights to the money that might come from a deep sea mining operation? Because there's all sorts of social and equity issues there too. So, who does own the deep sea and the deep sea bed?
So we have to distinguish between seabed in coastal waters, where the coastal state has jurisdiction over it. So Australia has ownership rights over the metals and mineral resources in our coastal waters here. But any metals on the international seabed beyond national jurisdiction are actually owned collectively by humanity at large. This was a really interesting legal construct. So it's called the common heritage of humankind. To explain that, we'll have to go back to the 1960s and 70s, when the United Nations sort of first became aware of the presence of polymetallic nodules, and then states tried to negotiate, well, who would be allowed to mine those minerals? Who would own them? And it was decided that what would need to be prevented is that a handful of states who would have the technology first can go and reap all the benefits at the expense of everyone else. So to avoid that, the legal status of the common heritage was given, I suppose, to the international seabed and all the mineral resources. So they belong collectively to all of us. And to give effect to that legal status, states decided to manage those minerals collectively through the International Seabed Authority. So that is an intergovernmental organisation headquartered in Jamaica, through which states decide who gets to mine and under what conditions. So anyone who wants to do any mining or even mineral exploration on the international seabed needs to have a contract from the International Seabed Authority.
And are they an entirely independent, uninfluenceable authority?
Well, they are legally independent, but they are an intergovernmental organisation just like any other intergovernmental
Complex,
organisation.
political, politicised.
That's right, yes. So we have over 160 member states who all need to agree on what standards should apply to seabed mining, both in terms of environmental standards, but also in terms of how any profits from mining should be shared. Because that's part of the common heritage principle as well, that any profits from mining will have to be shared. Now, states are currently negotiating what percentage of any profit would go to the International Seabed Authority, and then what you do with that money.
And it's governments doing the negotiations. Do citizens get a say? Do Indigenous people get a say who have custodial rights over some of these species and areas?
That's a really important question. So the members that negotiate are states, they're governments. We do have some observers from civil society, from environmental NGOs and so on, but we currently have no particular pathways for Indigenous communities to participate in those negotiations. And I think that's a fundamental problem that we've seen in those negotiations. Also in terms of human rights. So, of course, Indigenous communities have particular participatory rights under international law to have their intangible cultural heritage respected, but also to participate in decisions that affect them. And that's currently not safeguarded at the International Seabed Authority.
So where is the regulation up to? Where is it all up to at the moment? Because it's a hot time right now on this issue, isn't it?
It is. There's been a fair bit of pressure on the Seabed Authority to finalise its exploitation regulations, and those would be the regulations that set out what you need to do in order to get a commercial scale mining contract. We have a skeleton of those regulations, but nothing is agreed in those regulations. So there are aspects such as the environmental impact assessment process, for example, that might be reasonably straightforward by now, but we have aspects that haven't even been discussed yet, such as how any profits from mining would be shared.
We've touched on the environmental impact, but only just. There's so much to consider there, isn't there? I mean, we haven't talked about noise, for example. Echolocation and communicating through sound is so vital. And sonar, and there's all these ways of communicating that we only just barely understand. We don't fully understand what species are down there and what they're actually communicating using. So is that an issue? If you had a mining operation down there, you've got sound, you've got plumes of sediment rising up and down.
That's a key issue. And it's because we don't really understand, as Matt was saying, we don't really understand what the impacts of seabed mining will be. We have an idea of the categories of impact, but we don't understand the extent of those impacts. So we know that there'll be light pollution, there'll be noise pollution, we know there'll be sediment plumes, and we know that there's likely going to be metal contamination. But what the precise extent of those effects will be, we simply don't know. And in part that is to do with the fact that, as Matt said, we don't even know half the species in the deep ocean. So we haven't even discovered them, let alone study what their tolerance to noise and light pollution may be.
This is if all goes well, if the catastrophe arrives, that's an whole other question, like in the oil industry. They can guarantee, the industry says sometimes like, we can guarantee the safest pipeline or the safest whatever, but the day, the pipeline broke or the cargo ship, sank, the consequences are enormous. But that's the biggest problem with deep seabed mining also, even if we can do it the most environmentally friendly, let's say. If it breaks at one point, you have those pipelines, 4 kilometers of pipeline sucking up the nodules. If it breaks at one point, we have no clue how all the sediment can go through the water column, destroying. I mean, it's all the unknown also. That's,
And with every
tend to be
human
missed.
operation, there are risks. And you'd assume that they would do an environmental impact statement and assess those risks. Peter Hammarstedt, how do you see the regulation issue in terms of deep sea, high sea illegal fishing? Are governments doing enough? What could they do? And are governments sufficient?
Yeah, so I think a big challenge there is that for the high seas, in regard to fishing, everything is regulated essentially by what are known as regional fisheries management organizations, or RFMOs. And if you want to fish in the high seas, you have to essentially flag your ship to a country that's a member state to one of these RFMOs. In these RFMOs, a lot of decisions that have to be made unanimously. And that's why, despite the fact that with the squid fishery, despite the fact that many of these boats have a history of illegal fishing, where they would never get a license to fish in Australia, for example, because of a history of IUU, they're essentially allowed to continue to fish in the high seas because the People's Republic of China, which flags the vessel, allows them to do it.
IUU,
illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. And it's a term that's been used often now in the media without a lot of people fully understand, even people within the fishery space really understanding what that term means. If it's illegal fishing, it's easy. It's someone fishing without a license, fishing in a marine park, taking endangered species. If it's unreported fishing, it means here's a boat that's licensed to fish here, but they're not being honest about what they're taking. They may be taking too much, they may be taking a species different from what they're licensed to. But unregulated fishing, that means that this is a vessel that is not following the RFMO regulations, and this is the most difficult thing to stop.
So what's the solution, do you think?
It's a challenging solution because there's no United Nations Navy, there's no International Criminal Police Organization Navy, and so within this vacuum, civil society has to step up. There is a global push to set aside more marine protected areas, to set aside 30% of the world's oceans as marine protected area by 2030.
But people also want to eat fish.
People do, but at the same time, people have gotten an appetite for fish that isn't necessarily native to the culture of where they live. So, for example, people in Australia have an appetite for salmon, but salmon aren't naturally here. Salmon are being artificially farmed in Tasmania and escaping from pens where salmon aren't native, right? So part of it is looking at what our own eating habits are, what the impact of that is. And with 90% of the world's fisheries either overexploited or fully exploited, the question that we have to ask ourselves in wealthy countries, in developed countries, is do we have to eat fish at all? 25 years ago, I stopped eating fish.
Interesting. So the question is, would you give up fish? That might be the question for the day. A final question just to wrap, and that is, what is one thing at the top of your list that people in this audience could do to engage with this issue and the issues that we've aired today? Alina? Tricky. Peter?
I think what people have to do is recognize that we have a relationship with the oceans. We're not separate from it. And what's happening to the oceans in terms of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, IUU fishing, it doesn't just affect us, it affects neighboring countries in the region, people whose primary protein source comes from fish, people who depend on fish for their food security. And so if we're serious about protecting our neighbors, if we're serious about their national security, then we have to take IUU fishing seriously.
Matthieu?
Well, fundamentally, I think it's just to realize that we have a planet with finite resources. It comes from nickel in the seafloor or tuna. At one point, we're pushing the limit of what we extract, and we're pushing the planet to the brink of extinction. So I think being conscious is already very interesting. I mean, you can, for instance, you can decide to go full on, stopping eating any seafood, or at least, starting to be conscious of what you have in your plate, but also what car you buy, all the things, just understanding the supply chain from minerals all the way to protein, everything. Yeah. And just understanding that, what we buy, what we consume has consequences on the planet.
And finally to you, Alina, I'll give you another go.
So I think the number one issue would be to learn about the deep ocean and to not forget it. because it's quite easy, as Matt said at the beginning, to only look at the surface of the ocean, but of course most of the life actually does occur in the deep ocean. And then to learn about illegal fishing, seabed mining and so on, and ask questions of politicians, because they're ultimately the ones who make decisions about which industries go ahead and which do not.
What an interesting discussion. We've given you just a sort of bite-sized sample of the issues, which are really complex and really important, but incredibly topical right now. There's a lot going on both of these frontiers, the high seas and the deep seas. Please thank Aline, Jaekel, Peter Hammarstedt and Matthieu Rytz for being here at the Ocean Lovers Festival.
Thanks for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Ocean Ideas. Please make sure to share it with your networks and help us in our mission to turn ripples of action into waves of change for our blue planet.